The sun decided to wipe out entire civilizations, and only a human junkyard survived. While alien empires trusted elegant, advanced technology, one man bet on something ugly, heavy, and redundant, and outlasted the sun itself. Now, those who called humans trash are on their knees, begging for shelter so they don't die in the void. But when power changes hands at the worst possible moment, what is survival really worth? Before we go on, comment where you're watching from, because this story starts in the frozen Kuiper Belt and ends by reshaping an entire sector of the galaxy. The Kuiper Belt was not merely cold, it was the absolute zero of bureaucracy. 38 astronomical units out, where sunlight was a faint, theoretical suggestion. The silence was broken only by the low-frequency hum of the life support inside Ben's refuge. Colonel Benjamin Ben Hayes, retired, didn't bother with aesthetically pleasing composites or crystalline alloys. His construction was a crude monument to over-engineering, a bunker named the Ark, built from salvaged asteroid hulls, layered with 3 meters of dense, ferrous junk, scrap metals, spent reactor casings, and compacted micrometeoroid shields. Everything sealed with ugly industrial lithium polymer caulking. If it looked like a dumpster glued to a derelict mining node, that was because maximum mass equaled maximum radiation absorption. The Gilda Thrax, the dominant draconic species regulating this sector of deep space commerce, referred to the Ark officially as Non-Conforming Habitat 734b, a structure of significant aesthetic blight. Their official notices, delivered via pristine holographic manifests, always began with the same condescending preamble. The Thrax hegemony reiterates its mandate for the removal of all unsanitary and structurally superfluous materials from established orbital pathways. Your accumulation of human junk violates 6 current codes of transit and 17 statutes of visual compliance. Ben usually responded by adjusting the phase array output, turning their smooth, soothing bass tones into a static buzzsaw while he welded another foot of scrap titanium to the exterior hull. He knew their game. The Thrax built glittering habitats of hyper-efficient energy fields and shimmering ferroglass, relying on sophisticated, actively shielded grids to shunt away cosmic radiation. Their high-tech approach was elegant, but fragile. Ben's approach was simple: density. Primitive, dumb density. His fortress was a low-tech Faraday cage, encased in a small, dead moonlet. Today, however, the official Thrax warnings felt less important than the data stream flickering across his console. The data wasn't from the Gilda's regulated clean grid. It was raw, unpassed solar diagnostics channeled through an ancient deep space probe he had privately reactivated. The plasma effluvium signature had spiked 400% in the last 6 hours. "Winter flare," Ben muttered, tapping the hard light display. The designation was a misnomer given the distance, but the effect was catastrophic. The sun, usually a distant temperate star from this vantage, was belching. A coronal mass ejection, CME, of unprecedented magnitude, the largest recorded in 3 centuries, was heading straight for their sector. The Thrax had contingencies for a Class 5 pulse. This was a Class 9. Ben took a deep, steadying breath, savoring the controlled environment of his refuge. The internal gravity generators maintained a comfortable 105G, and the air was recycled through old-growth hydroponics, the smell of soil and ozone mixed with the faint metallic tang of his tools. He checked the power reservoirs. 100% on the geothermal tap, 100% on the cold fusion backup. All vital systems were shielded and physically redundant. He wasn't relying on smart fields. He was relying on lead, concrete, and sheer physical mass. He had 47 minutes until the leading edge of the electromagnetic pulse, EMP, hit, followed shortly by the main proton torrent. At the 30-minute mark, the comm system flared to life. It wasn't the usual automated threat assessment. It was a direct, Urgent hail on a high-priority encrypted frequency reserved for interguilda diplomatic emergency. Ben hesitated, his hand hovering over the acceptance rune. He recognized the originating signature, the Grand Crystal Citadel of Thraxia. He activated the feed. The image resolved, not as the usual holographic projection, but as a shaky, real-time video feed, a sign that their processing capabilities were already suffering. Consul Draca appeared. Draca was the head of the local Thrax guild, a massive dragonoid, her scales the color of polished obsidian, and her frame usually adorned with shimmering silks. Now, her expression was tight, etched with a panic that momentarily dissolved her natural arrogance. "Human. Ben Hayes," Draca hissed, her voice struggling to maintain the cool, baritone control she was known for. "We require immediate assistance. The outer dampening arrays are showing critical instability. We have diverted all power to core shielding, but simulations indicate a 73% probability of cascading failure within the next solar minute." Ben leaned back in his ancient, salvaged command chair. He noticed the background of her video feed. The flawless crystalline walls were flickering, the air thick with static. "Consul Draca," Ben replied, his voice calm, the perfect counterpoint to her agitation. "You are requesting emergency protocols from non-conforming habitat 734B, the structure of significant aesthetic blight?" Draca's pupils dilated, a spasm of rage crossing her face, instantly suppressed by stark terror. For the Thrax, seeking aid from a lesser species, a species they had actively sought to displace, was an existential shame. "Hayes, this is not a moment for your species' juvenile posturing. We are discussing the preservation of the Thrax hegemony's entire sector presence." "I am aware of what we are discussing, Consul," Ben said, his tone turning clinical. "You failed to plan for a Class 9 event. Your elegant, energy-intensive solution is proving insufficient." Ben checked his internal clock. 18 minutes. Suddenly, the screen behind Draca went white, then sputtered into deep, silent blackness. Draca froze, her scaled hand flying instinctively to her ornate collar. Then, the static returned, but this time it was raw, primal. "Hayes, the main power grid is down! Repeat, main power is offline! We are running solely on auxiliary reactors, which are unprotected!" Draca practically shrieked, the regal veneer completely shattered. "You are in the dead zone. Your crude, massive construction. It is functioning. You must open your shelter, now." Ben looked past the distraught face of the consul. His own external sensor feed was dropping data packets like raindrops, filtering through the rapidly thickening cosmic noise. The EMP had arrived. Inside the Ark, the only indication was a tiny, high-pitched ping, the sound of the ancient, electromagnetically hardened emergency beacon activating. A moment later, every unsecured piece of electronic equipment in the entire sector outside his shielded bubble died. Silence returned, absolute and terrifying. The only remaining light came from the interior emergency glow strips and the frantic, desperate face of the dragonoid consul on the hardened video link. Ben looked at the consul, who had spent years demanding the removal of his human junk. "Consul Draca," Ben said slowly, a deliberate pause elongating the moment. "I understand the situation, but you should know, the Ark has very limited capacity, and the price of entry is high." Draca's proud head bowed slightly, the ultimate humiliation in her species. "Name it, human. We will pay." Ben smiled, a quiet, cold smile born of grim vindication, knowing that survival often trumped aesthetics, and that sometimes the only things that survived were the things built to be ugly and unbreakable. The hardened video link buzzed faintly, a counterpoint to the deep, resonant hum of the Ark's primary magnetic dampeners. Outside, the blizzard was raging, not of snow or wind, but of solar plasma, and raw, unfiltered energy. Ben felt the faint, comforting vibrations through the deck plating. His structure was absorbing punishment that was currently incinerating lesser vessels kilometers away. "The price," Ben began, his voice measured, lacking the haste that defined every moment of Draka's rapidly accelerating doom. "It is not credits, Consul. Your species values decorum and influence above all else. That is what I am buying." Draka hissed, a sound like grinding stone over poorly treated metal, her immense, scaled hands gripping the edge of what appeared to be her command console. Her normally immaculate crimson scales seemed dulled by a thin film of sweat, and the regal jewelry adorning her horns looked heavy, irrelevant. "Be specific, Hayes. We are running out of time. The secondary reactors are fluctuating wildly. The shielding is at 40% and dropping fast." The desperation in her tone was intoxicatingly sweet after years of patronizing contempt. "First," Ben continued, ticking the points off on his fingers, slow and deliberate, "all guild sanctions against the human sector are permanently lifted. All outstanding fines, especially those leveled against my ugly structure, are erased and repaid in full to the colonists you attempted to cripple." Draka gave a curt, impatient nod. "Done. Petty finances. What else?" Ben paused, allowing the pregnant silence to stretch, forcing the consul to bathe in the silence of his security and the deafening noise of her impending destruction. "Second, the Thrax Guild will issue a formalized, sector-wide public statement, broadcast on every surviving channel, admitting that your advanced aesthetic shielding solution failed due to inherent design flaws, and that the human junk was the superior necessary preparation." Draka's head snapped up, her golden eyes narrowing into twin slits of incandescent rage. She was an apex predator forced to beg for carrion. "You demand shame. You demand the utter dissolution of our political capital," she spat, the sound echoing metallically through the bunker speakers. "I demand honesty, Consul," Ben countered, his expression utterly flat. "And third, and this is non-negotiable, the Ark becomes extraterritorial. Human sovereignty. It operates entirely outside Thrax jurisdiction, forever. You want salvation? You pay with the one thing you cherish more than life, your authority." The feed flickered violently, a brief wash of white noise drowning out Draka's image. It was a visceral representation of her crumbling world. Ben waited, watching the internal stress monitors, 15 minutes remaining until the peak of the pulse. Draka reappeared, her breath heavy and ragged. She was looking away from the camera, clearly consulting with someone off-screen, a whispered, rapid exchange in the sharp, clicking Thrax language. The sounds were guttural, filled with conflict. Finally, she looked back at Ben. The hate in her eyes was a visible thing, a heat Ben could almost feel despite the distance. But beneath it lay the cold, hard arithmetic of survival. "Hayes," she said, the name of venomous challenge. "You are a scavenger. You are taking advantage of a cosmic anomaly to seize power." "Survival is not an aesthetic, Consul. It's a mechanism," Ben replied, shifting his gaze slightly toward the digital clock above the display. 14, 12. Draka slammed her fist against the console, the sound cracking sharply even through the heavily filtered audio. "We accept the terms. Open the bay, human, now. We have 6 primary personnel, including myself, and 4 critically injured staff members. If we die, the treaty dies with us, Hayes. Remember that." "Don't threaten me, Consul. You're already indebted," Ben murmured, reaching out to the heavy, reinforced lever that controlled the massive outer airlock door. The mechanism whined in protest, straining against the external pressure. He flicked a switch, and a warning light, crimson, fittingly, began flashing over the airlock controls. "The Ark is opening its mouth, Consul. You have exactly 3 minutes to get inside before the door cycle's closed. After that, No power on this side of the Kuiper Belt can open it until the storm passes. Move. Fast. The hydraulic roar of the outer seal releasing was deafening even through the triple-layered walls of the inner control room. Ben watched the display. The exterior hull camera, which had been perfectly stable just moments before, now showed the opening aperture framed by a shimmering, painful violet light. The ionizing radiation filtering through layers of atmosphere and residual shielding, turning the usually black void into a sickly, incandescent menace. The main door of the Ark, a salvaged, 5-meter-thick slab of asteroid-grade titanium reinforced with repurposed satellite structural beams, began its slow, agonizing retraction. The process was intentionally sluggish. Speed meant structural compromise in this environment. "You have 180 seconds, Consul." Ben's voice was clipped, emotionless. He watched the internal monitors. The pressure differential was enormous. They weren't fighting vacuum. They were fighting the solar pulse, a massive wave of plasma and hard radiation that felt like a localized cosmic explosion. Draca was the first one visible, appearing suddenly in the camera's view, her large, scaled body silhouetted against the lethal glow. She wore a heavy environmental suit, though Ben noted the Thrax technology, usually polished obsidian and gold, looked scorched and warped in several places. She did not hesitate. She moved with brute efficiency, ducking under the receding doorframe, shoving past a panicked-looking subordinate and collapsing onto the grated floor of the airlock vestibule. "Move the wounded!" Draca roared into her comms, the sound echoing harshly in the confined space before being muffled by the closing door. "Push them." A second, third, and fourth Thrax piled in. Lizard-like bipeds with sleek, agile frames, now moving with desperate awkwardness, hauling dead weight. The 4 injured staff members were bundled masses of crumpled suits and limp limbs, clearly incapacitated. The timer dropped to 1:52. The airlock vestibule was designed for efficiency, not comfort, and it was quickly overcrowding. Ben watched a brief, violent flash of crimson on the exterior display, a localized solar flare impact. The outer door mechanism gave a sickening metallic screech, threatening to stall. Ben slapped the override control, pumping more emergency pressure into the hydraulics. "Don't test my engineering, Consul. If that door sticks, you're all paced." 1 minute 30 seconds, someone yelled hysterically through Draca's unsecured channel. The 5th and 6th personnel scrambled in. Ben counted. 8 bodies were inside, mostly piled around the airlock periphery. The Thrax species were naturally large, and 10 adults, 6 walking, 4 dead weight, filled the space beyond capacity. Then came the complication. The last surviving member of Draca's immediate retinue was struggling to drag the final heaviest casualty. The injured Thrax's foot caught on the threshold just as the massive door reached its final 3/4 closure mark. "He's stuck!" the healthy Thrax screamed. Draca, already inside and leaning against the interior bulkhead, straightened instantly, fury replacing dread. "Leave him. Close the bay." Ben's hand froze above the manual seal activator. He had offered refuge for all 10. He watched the struggling figure, the rescuer frantically tugging, the door descending, the gap rapidly diminishing. If the door slammed onto the casualty, it wouldn't just kill that individual. The structural breach would jeopardize the entire airlock and, potentially, the main seal. "Get that foot free!" Ben snapped, overriding Draca's internal comms and projecting his voice into the vestibule. His tone cut through the fear and the metallic grinding. The rescuer glanced up at the ceiling camera, visible relief and resentment warring on his face. Draca was shouting contradictory orders, prioritizing the completion of the seal. The timer showed 0. 45. The rescuer gave one final, desperate heave, tearing the injured Thrax free, just as the leading edge of the titanium slab hit the floor with a bone-jarring impact. The final, healthy Thrax dove headlong into the vestibule, landing hard on the pile of wounded, just as the heavy primary seal began to engage with an echoing, authoritative clunk. Ben sagged back, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. 10. All 10 were inside. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He hit the depressurization and decontamination cycle, initiating the sequence that would cycle the lethal external atmosphere out and stabilize the interior environment. Consul, the preliminary decontamination cycle is starting. Do not attempt to open the inner hatch until the green light illuminates, Ben commanded. And remember your place. You are not guests. You are cargo. The inner view of the airlock, now separated from the raging solar storm by 5 meters of metal and a fully pressurized seal, showed Draca slowly rising to her feet. Her posture was stiff, her breathing ragged, visible through the slight fogging of her helmet visor. She didn't look at the wounded. She looked straight at the camera. "Hayes," she snarled, the sound now clear but saturated with raw humiliation and loathing. The moment this storm passes, the terms of this sovereignty agreement will be subject to review. Ben leaned forward, his face inches from his own shielded camera. The control room lights reflected in his eyes, making them look sharp and cold. "No, Consul. They won't," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous near whisper. "Because the contract was signed under duress. By your admission, yes. But the witness was the sun itself. And right now, the sun is proving that my junk heap is the only thing capable of preserving your miserable life." He cut the airlock audio feed, letting her stand in furious silence, surrounded by the physical evidence of her failure and his superior foresight. Above the main control panel, the digital clock flashed the remaining peak duration, Adro 8:50. The pulse was still intensifying. Ben activated the inner airlock display for the trapped Thrax. A simple green light, a countdown of minutes until they could enter the safety of his human refuge. It was a visual reminder that for the next hour, their very existence depended on the mercy of the scavenger they had once tried to erase. The decontamination cycle finished with a sharp clack, the green light blazing triumphantly above the inner hatch. The heavy insulated steel door hissed, groaning reluctantly before gliding sideways into the wall recess, revealing the interior of the primary refuge, a space of exposed conduit, thick ceramic plating, and the dull, unpolished resilience of practical engineering. Ben watched Draca step out. She was massive, easily 2.5 meters tall, even hunched slightly from the stress of the near-fatal evacuation. The polished gold scales of her ritual armor were scorched, pitted with micrometeorite impacts fused by the solar plasma. She moved with the predatory grace of her species, but the fatigue was a heavy cloak. "Welcome, Consul," Ben said into the general communication array, his voice echoing slightly in the main vault. "You have approximately 7 minutes before the atmosphere stabilizes enough for suit removal. I suggest you attend to your wounded." Draca ignored the suggestion. Her reptilian eyes scanned the ceiling, the junction boxes, the hastily installed atmospheric scrubbers, every sign of the structure she had previously designated a sore on the celestial plane. "Where are the others?" she demanded, the hum of her translator struggling slightly against the ambient whine of the magnetic shielding. "The crew quarters," Ben replied, his eyes locked on the thermal readouts. He noted the increased core temperature. The structure was holding, but the input was immense. "They are in suspended animation, minimizing resource draw, a luxury you will not enjoy." Draca took 3 heavy steps toward the console, her clawed gauntlet resting heavily on the metallic railing that separated the control platform from the rest of the vault. The sound of her heavy breathing was unnervingly close. "You believe you are safe, Hayes?" she sneered. "This rat hole is shaking. The structural integrity is compromised. Our analysis indicated your makeshift shielding would only sustain. A deafening thrum cut her off, not a vibration, but a percussive blow that traveled through the bedrock anchors and rattled the entire structure. Lights flickered violently in the main vault, bathing the 10 Thrax in a blinding, strobing red. A high-pitched, agonizing squeal erupted from the energy capacitor banks directly above them. Ben didn't flinch. He simply tapped a single key on his console, and the emergency power flow rerouted. The high-pitched squeal subsided, replaced by a low, persistent growl. That console was a secondary coronal mass component arriving far sooner than predicted, Ben stated calmly, his gaze fixed on the flashing warning icon that indicated temporary overload on the primary magnetic shunt. Your analysis was based on predictable Thrax materials and protocols. This rat hole, as you call it, is built on simple, redundant principles, layers of density, not layers of finesse. It survives because I expected failure at every step. He spun his chair around, finally meeting her eyes, 2 black holes of rage and disbelief framed by scaled ridges. Now, listen very carefully, Consul Draker. I have a critical oxygen balance and a closed-loop environment. Your 9 injured crew members, 3 of whom are bleeding profusely, are still in non-sterilized evacuation suits. Draker recoiled as if struck. We are not carrying pathogens, human. I don't care if you're carrying flowers, Consul. Biological waste is waste, Ben said, his tone utterly devoid of emotion. My system detects organic foreign matter. If you do not isolate the wounded immediately, and I mean now, the environment regulators will flag them as contaminated. The automated protocols will flush the localized air zone with stabilizing inert gas to protect the core population. He let the implication hang in the air. If she failed to comply, her own wounded would suffocate under his automatic safety measures. Where is this isolation area? Draker demanded through clenched teeth, the need to protect her clan finally overriding her monumental ego. Ben pointed to a small, heavily shielded section of the wall, marked only by a stylized human skull and crossbones, a warning sign he'd scavenged decades ago. The quarantine bay. You will secure your 3 most severe casualties inside. You will order them to remove their damaged suits immediately. Then, you will seal the door. My medical drone will stabilize them from the external feed. The remaining 6 will wait by the wall, facing away from the center mass. Do you understand the instructions, Consul? This was the true test. He wasn't just asking her to obey. He was forcing the proudest, most authoritative being in the sector to become a glorified nurse, following the precise, mundane, life-saving protocols established by the Lixo Humano. Draka stared at the skull symbol. Her huge chest plate rose and fell rapidly. The sheer humiliation of submitting to human instruction in a structure built by a human outcast was nearly visible as a physical aura around her. I understand, she bit out, the single word costing her more than any battle loss. Ben watched on the monitor as Draker moved with brutal efficiency. She roared orders to the remaining Thrax. They handled the 3 limp bodies, one missing a section of its wing structure, another with heavy burns to its sensory organs, and dragged them to the quarantine bay. The hatch sealed with a definitive thunk. Ben immediately activated the inner communication panel for the bay. Suits off now, or the gas cycles, Ben commanded through the speaker, offering no room for protest. A moment later, the thermal imaging confirmed it. 1, then 2. Then the 3rd suit fell to the floor of the quarantine bay. For the first time, Draker's warriors were exposed and vulnerable in the refuge of the hated human. The solar peak was 06, 12 away, and the foundation of human sovereignty was being cemented in scorched metal and desperate compliance. The air in the control bunker was thick with ozone and the metallic scent of stressed plating. Every few seconds, a deep, resonant groan echoed through the sub-level structure, a sound like a leviathan shifting its weight, the reinforced hull adjusting to the immense gravimetric shear exerted by the solar pulse. Ben watched the timer, 05:45, until maximum peak fluence. In the quarantine bay, the medical drone, a repurposed mining bot fitted with bioscanners and sterile injectors, was administering coagulants and stabilizing agents. Ben's internal diagnostic screens flickered, showing dangerously high external radiation indexes, but the containment field around the bunker held firm, converting the lethal plasma wash into benign, if loud, thermal energy. He switched the comms to the general area where Draka and the remaining 6 Thrax warriors stood, rigid and alien, their faces obscured by the residual heat shimmer of their deactivated power armor. "Consul Draka." Ben's voice was flat, devoid of the satisfaction he felt pooling in his gut. "Your internal shields are failing at an exponential rate. Your physiology is not designed for this energy density. Your advanced Gilda systems failed because they prioritize aesthetics over redundancy." Draka hissed, a sound like dry sand scattering over rock. "Silence, human. Focus on the wounded. You lecture us on design when your sanctuary is a disgrace of mismatched alloys and stolen components." Ben leaned closer to the mic, his eyes fixed on the external diagnostics. The sound outside was escalating, turning into a high-pitched whine that vibrated through the very floor plates. "This structure," Ben countered, his voice steadying the sudden tremor in the bunker's spine, "is built entirely on function. Every weld, every joint, every rusted plate you mocked was rated 40% above the theoretical maximum catastrophic failure point. Your beautiful, sleek structures, Consul, are dust now, atomized by solar wind because they prioritized minimizing structural mass for faster intersector transit." He paused, letting the external chaos speak for itself. A particularly violent surge hit the bunker. The lights momentarily dipped, bathing the chamber in the emergency red glow, and the Thrax warriors flinched simultaneously. "In 10 seconds, I will initiate an atmospheric dampening cycle. This bunker operates on a closed-loop system, extremely clean air. Your external armor is shedding microscopic particulate matter and residual solar energy. If you contaminate my air, you die." Ben didn't wait for her response. He activated the command. A low, powerful whoosh sounded from hidden vents. Draka watched, visible rage in her stance, as a fine, invisible mist, the dampening agent, rolled over their boots and was immediately pulled into high-capacity scrubbers. "What is this indignity?" she finally demanded, her voice tight with suppressed power. She took a step toward the control console, her taloned hand curling into a fist. "You treat us like biological hazards, like vermin." Ben finally turned his chair, facing the monitor showing the 8 imposing alien figures. He met Draka's glare with the cold, tired gaze of a man who had been right for too long. "I treat you exactly as your guild treated us, Consul. Remember the fines, the non-conforming waste disposal tariffs. You penalized us for using materials that were visually incompatible with the glorious Thrax sector aesthetic. You called my necessary structures lixo humano, human garbage." The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the screeching plasma outside and the rhythmic, clinical clicks of the drone working in the quarantine bay. "Now," Ben continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous intensity, "the garbage is all that remains. You are in my house, Draka. You will obey the protocols established by the vermin, and you will thank the structures that your civilization deemed unworthy." He gestured toward the external monitor, which displayed the fluctuating energy levels, rapidly closing in on the point of maximum intensity. "Less than 4 minutes. I need absolute silence and compliance. Do not interrupt my focus again. If I miss one calculation because of your ego, we all perish." Draka's serpentine neck strained, Her eyes narrowed slits of green fire. She was trapped, physically, ideologically, and existentially. The realization that this simple, despised human held the lever to her species' survival in this sector was a poison she was forced to swallow. With a monumental effort that seemed to drain the remaining heat from the room, she lowered her head a fraction of an inch. A silent, grinding concession. "We comply, human," she rasped, the title sounding like a curse, yet carrying the weight of total surrender. Ben turned back to the console, the tension in the bunker tightening like a vice. The solar storm was screaming now, a tangible, physical force trying to tear the salvage shelter apart. He braced his hands on the console, preparing for the peak impact, knowing that even his over-engineered structure might not survive the full wrath of the ancient star. The digital counter above the main console blinked. T-000-58. The roar outside transitioned from the high-pitched shriek of energized plasma to a deep, visceral grinding. It was the sound of millions of tons of repurposed metal meticulously welded and anchored into the solid ice of the Kuiper Belt, protesting violently against the solar onslaught. Ben slammed his hand down on the primary stabilization array trigger. A jolt, heavy and localized, shuddered through the floor plates. He felt the compressed air taste of ozone and hot circuitry. "Stabilizers engaged," Ben muttered, his eyes glued to the kinetic dampening readout. The Thrax platforms relied on elegant, energy-intensive force fields. Ben's design relied on brute force mass and counter-frequency shunts. Ugly, slow, but fundamentally reliable. The lights flickered, dipping the bunker into a brief, frightening twilight. Emergency reds pulsed along the bulkheads. Draka, standing rigidly near the entrance to the quarantine bay, gripped the metallic frame with claws that could shear durasteel. She had been observing Ben's frantic, yet utterly precise, movements. Her alien physiology, built for command and atmospheric control, struggled with the sheer lack of space and the overwhelming violence of the low-frequency vibrations hammering the shelter. "The structural integrity is fluctuating," Draka stated, her voice tight, unable to fully mask the tremor of her inner fear. Her dragonoid senses were screaming warnings that her complex, refined ships would have already obeyed. Flee, evade, dissipate. But here, there was no dissipation, only compression. Ben didn't look away from the display. The sheer arrogance of her analysis, even in this dire moment, pricked his raw nerves. "It's not fluctuating on console. It's holding, which is more than I can say for your precious crystallized scaffolding out there," Ben retorted, his words clipped and unforgiving. "One wrong calculation, one momentary hesitation in the dampening field, and the entire structure sublimes. Your analysis is irrelevant. Silence now." T-00-25. The pressure spike hit the exterior hull like a physical fist. The bunker groaned, a low, dying sound that resonated deep in the chest cavity. Dust, a mixture of space grit and fine particles shaken loose from decades of neglect, danced in the air, catching the stuttering emergency light. Ben leaned into the console, bracing for the worst. He wasn't relying on automated systems anymore. He was manually calculating the phase shift offsets needed to keep the magnetic shunts running ahead of the incoming particle wave. It was a dance between physics and human stubbornness. He could smell Draka's exotic fear, a faint metallic scent mixed with something musky and volcanic. She was breathing shallowly, her pupils wide. The environment was overwhelming her. "The noise," Draka whispered, a genuine admission of distress escaping her control. "It's like the sound of the universe tearing itself." "That's exactly what it is," Ben said, his tone softening slightly, not in comfort, but in grim affirmation of the horror. "The core of our star, stripping everything away. This is the moment the universe reminds us of scale, Consul. and it doesn't care about aesthetics or tariffs. T0008. The air went thick and hot. All exterior communications dropped out entirely, a flat dead line on the monitor. The kinetic dampening readout spiked into the high red zone, far beyond the initial safety parameters. "Hold fast," Ben breathed, his jaw tight. He pushed the magnetic flux governors past the red line, injecting a surge of raw reserve power. This was the moment his lixo-humano structure either proved its worth or became a funeral pyre. The final 3 seconds dissolved into pure sensation. The shriek of metal, the smell of burnt electrical insulation, and the terrifying grinding vibration that suggested the very walls were turning into liquid. T0. Maximum intensity. The bunker didn't just shake, it screamed. A massive wave of pressure, far exceeding the initial projections, slammed into the shelter. The overhead lights exploded in a burst of sparks. The internal environment collapsed into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the frantic, dying flicker of the console screens, painting Ben's determined face and Draker's rigid, terrified figure in strobing hues of crimson and sickly green. Ben's hands were clamped onto the controls, his knuckles white. The emergency systems were screaming their failure, but the structure, built with ugly, necessary redundancy, refused to yield. It vibrated, it protested, but it held. Then Draker saw it. Along the main hull support beam directly opposite her, a hairline crack, not in the metal but in the layered ceramic shielding, began to glow with an intense, deadly blue light, the sign of superheated particle penetration. Before she could form a warning, a thin stream of pure, lethal plasma spat into the air, sizzling against the humidity. It was a minute fracture, a breach barely wider than a stylus, but it represented catastrophic failure. "Ben." Draker finally shrieked, her control dissolving entirely, reverting to the basic survival instinct of a predator faced with absolute peril. Ben, his eyes dilated against the strobing darkness, tracked the trajectory of the plasma jet. He knew the risk. If that stream widened, they had seconds. "Hold," Ben commanded, his voice a strained whisper against the external roar, focusing all his remaining energy on the manual override for the secondary shielding array, an array the Thrax Guild had deemed excessive and non-compliant in his original blueprints. "Just hold." The pressurized hiss of the plasma jet was not loud, but it was absolute. It sounded like the universe tearing a thin sheet of paper, and the air around it immediately warped, the metallic smell of pure heat overriding the burnt plastic odor. Draka recoiled, her thick, scaled hand instinctively covering the sensitive membranes around her neck. The sheer energy radiating from that pinprick breach was enough to sterilize and vaporize tissue instantly. The refined alloys of the Thrax Guild would never have allowed such a failure. Their systems were supposed to distribute kinetic loads flawlessly. Ben's ugly, layered ceramic steel proved it was possible. "Hold," Ben repeated, his face a mask of sweating stone, illuminated by the struggling red indicator light of the primary power shunt. He wasn't looking at the plasma, but at the console. He was gambling on the structural integrity of his own excessive caution. He didn't hit a button. He didn't execute a smooth command sequence. Ben leveraged his entire weight against the main rotary lever marked AUX, SHLD, activate, and forced it down through layers of mechanical resistance. It was a brutal, non-digital, purely physical command. The bunker screamed again, but this time the sound came from deep within the supporting structure, a deafening, metallic clang whump that seemed to shake the very ground beneath the Kuiper rock. The secondary shield array, a thick shell of borosilicate concrete mixed with high-density ferrous material, usually reserved for deep space mining operations, had deployed. It wasn't elegant. It was meant to stop asteroids, not subatomic particles, but its density was its defense. The blue light radiating from the hairline fracture snapped off, immediately replaced by the sickening scent of pulverized ceramic and hot metal scraping against metal. The plasma jet vanished, silenced by the brute force protection. The intense roar outside, the sound of the solar pulse at its zenith, began its slow, grinding descent. The vibration lessened from a bone-jarring rattle to a deep, tolerable hum, like a distant, overworked engine. Silence didn't return immediately, but the relative quiet after the cacophony felt like a vacuum. The emergency lights, dim and dusty, flickered back to life, revealing the debris and scorched wires dangling from the ceiling. Ben released the lever. He slumped back against the reinforced chair, his chest heaving, his body language speaking of total exhaustion, yet his eyes, sharp and clear, were fixed on the residual monitoring display. "Status," he rasped, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a shaking hand. The AI, now functioning at minimal capacity, responded in a cool, synthesized baritone that was jarringly calm. Containment at 98, 7%. External environmental hazard is rapidly subsiding. Projected survivability of the structural integrity, 96 hours, minimum. Well done, Colonel. Ben took a deep, shuddering breath. 96 hours. Plenty of time. Draker, however, was still frozen, staring at the scarred section of the wall where the blue death had briefly materialized. The dragonoid's usual haughtiness had been replaced by a raw, primal fear she hadn't felt since she was a fledgling, fighting for scraps in the void. She finally turned to Ben, her scales dull with dust, her ornate uniform torn near the shoulder. She had been prepared to die with dignity on her own pristine platform. Instead, she was alive, smelling of oil and ozone, saved by the very structure she had designated for demolition. The pulse, Draker managed, her voice thick, still vibrating with adrenaline. Has it passed its peak? Yeah, Ben confirmed, adjusting a cufflink, deliberately casual. It peaked, thanks to a few non-compliant, excessive, and frankly ugly redundancies. He let the words hang there, sharp and bitter as rust. Draka's gaze narrowed, the golden fire in her eyes briefly rekindling, fighting the urge to lash out. She was the hierarch of the Thrax Guild. She did not take sarcasm from humans, but her arrogance crumbled under the weight of a far greater fear, the fate of her orbiting platforms. The Thrax Guild ships, elegant and streamlined, were optimized for speed and efficiency, not blunt force impact. They had no ugly backups. Our fleet, she began, struggling to keep her composure, trying to reclaim the authoritative tone that usually silenced entire councils. The primary shielding arrays on the Vindicare and the refueling stations, their projected tolerance was 5 times the established threshold. Ben leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his expression utterly devoid of sympathy. And this pulse was 3 times that threshold. What's your point, Hierarch? Draker swallowed hard. Asking for help was humiliation. Asking for help from this being, this relic, this human who she had personally designated as galactic detritus, was a metaphysical collapse. Yet she saw the images in her mind, the elegant, sophisticated, yet fundamentally brittle Thrax structures turning into clouds of ionized gas. Colonel Ben, she stated, her voice lowering to a tense, almost unnatural formality. The primary orbital assets of the Thrax Guild are, empirically speaking, compromised. The energy dissipation matrix failed immediately. We have thousands of essential personnel, many of them members of the High Clades, adrift and unprotected in the debris field. Ben simply waited, watching her squirm. The silence was heavier than the solar pulse had been. Draker finally broke. She lifted her chin, but the golden eyes held a desperate plea. We require your immediate assistance in extraction and sheltering. Your facility, though primitive, is currently the only known functional haven in this sector. You are obligated to provide refuge for the survivors of the Thrax clades. Ben smiled, a slow, cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was the smile of a man who had been called trash for 20 years and now held the keys to the kingdom. Obligated? Ben repeated softly, pushing himself back to his feet. He walked slowly toward the sealed hatch, retrieving a discarded energy pistol from the floor where it had fallen. Hierarch, he said, turning back to face her, the weapon now resting loosely in his hand. You designated this entire structure as non-compliant. You fined me into bankruptcy. You threatened to dismantle my refuge and seize my scrap heap. You declared me and my kind lixo-humano, human garbage. He pointed the pistol, not at her, but toward the sealed airlock. The emergency broadcast channel is open. I am receiving thousands of distress signals right now from Thrax and others. I can deploy the recovery drones. I have the capacity. But I don't run a charity organization, Hierarch. He met her terrified gaze, the pure vindication finally flooding his tired system. You want refuge for your precious clades. You want the trash to save you? Ben paused, the pistol grip warm in his hand. Then you need to tell me exactly how you plan to pay for the privilege. The Hierarch's golden eyes narrowed, flickering momentarily with the ancient predatory rage her species was known for, before the sheer, cold terror of the situation wrestled her composure back into submission. The sound of distant, distorted emergency beacons continued to flood the bunker's comm system, high-pitched, desperate wails of energy signatures failing permanently. Payment? Draca's voice was strained, thick with disbelief that she was even having this conversation with a creature she considered barely sapient. We control the primary mining assets in 3 sectors, Colonel. We can offer you exclusive rights to the argon fields on K-12, a fortune in refined helium-3, triple the compensation for your structural non-compliance. Ben watched the sweat beads slightly on her forehead, glistening against the jade scales near her temples. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between them just enough to force her to tilt her head back. The gun remained resting carelessly against his thigh. You believe this is about money, Hierarch? Ben's voice was dangerously quiet, the softest sound in the humming bunker. You believe the debt accrued over 20 years of humiliation, fines, and the constant threat of planetary eviction can be covered by a percentage of gaseous ore. He paused, letting the implications sink in. Keep your currency, Draca. I want something you value more than credits. Draca's facial muscles tightened. She understood the shift in power now. This wasn't a standard negotiation, it was vengeance disguised as a transaction. Name it, human, she hissed, her breath slightly sulphurous. But understand that any violation of the galactic economic codes will be met with immediate punitive force once this immediate crisis is resolved. Ben laughed, a harsh, dry sound devoid of amusement. Threats still? Even when your high clades are turning to frozen carbon dust outside my walls, the galactic economic codes, they were written by you, for you, to define us as subclass labor. Those codes died with your orbital defense grid 20 minutes ago. He lifted the pistol slowly, pointing it this time at the screen displaying the frantic, failing Thrax transponders. I want a formal, verifiable declaration of withdrawal, Ben stated, his eyes steel. The Thrax Guild will evacuate this sector entirely. Every mining claim, every orbital station, every monitoring buoy. It all becomes neutral territory, permanently relinquished by the Guild. Draca's jaw dropped, a flicker of true shock dominating her features. That is impossible. We have billions invested here. This is a central trade route. Refuge is non-negotiable, Hierarch. That is the price for lifting a single recovery drone. Complete, verifiable, irreversible abandonment of Sector 7 Delta. The distress calls on the monitor spiked in frequency. Ben watched the energy signatures of 3 separate high-ranking vessels wink out simultaneously. They were freezing to death, rapidly. Draka's posture started to collapse. Her magnificent scaled shoulders slumped slightly. The arrogance was melting away under the brutal pressure of mathematics and cold vacuum. "And what else?" she whispered, the defeat momentarily making her sound raw and genuinely vulnerable. "What other pound of flesh do you require, Colonel?" Ben stepped closer still, his shadow falling over her, making the small space feel suffocatingly intimate. "The designation," he said simply. "I want a full, public retraction of the term Lixo Humano across all known Thrax broadcast channels. It must be delivered by you, personally, Hierarch. You will declare the species Homo sapiens autonomous, sovereign, and deserving of equal, unburdened trade status." Draka recoiled as if struck by the demand. Her fingers clenched, the sharp black claws digging into the soft material of her uniform. The cost wasn't the territory. The cost was the absolute destruction of her social standing, the public admission that the very trash she despised was their superior, their savior. I cannot do that," she stammered, shaking her head rapidly. "It is an affront to the High Council. They would strip me of rank, execute me. Then they will die cold and alone, just like your precious clades outside," Ben replied, his voice maintaining its chilling calm. He gestured toward the screen. "Look, Draka. Another one. And another. Every second you debate the nuances of your pride, your essential personnel, the very foundation of your power, are being extinguished. You have maybe 15 minutes before the last remaining life support on those failing transports depletes its emergency reserves." The gravity of the situation hit her with physical force. Draka swallowed hard, her golden eyes wide, darting between Ben's implacable face and the blinking dying lights on the console. She smelled the metallic tang of fear now, mixed with the stagnant air of the bunker. "The sector relinquished," she finally conceded, the words ripped from her throat like rusty shrapnel. "And the public declaration, the apology, yes, I agree. Now, deploy your recovery assets. Now, before it is too late." Ben slowly holstered the energy pistol. He didn't rush. He didn't even smile. "Good," he said, pulling up the controls for the drone deployment. "But understand this, Hierarch. The price is paid before the service is rendered. The declaration of withdrawal and the broadcasted retraction must be initiated and confirmed on my terminal within the next 5 minutes. Do that, and the garbage saves you. Fail, and you can tell your dying clades that your pride was simply too heavy to abandon." Draka's hands, shaking violently, hovered over the scarred utilitarian console Ben had designated. It was crude, a mismatched collection of salvaged human and repurposed alien hardware, completely lacking the elegant biometric interfaces she was accustomed to. Yet it pulsed with life, a sturdy heart beating within the steel chest of the bunker. "The broadcast must be sector-wide," Ben commanded, leaning over her shoulder, his proximity a tight, suffocating leash. "Priority override. Thrax Gilda authentication. I need to see the confirmation tag on my screen before the sweepers deploy." Her golden scales, usually iridescent with vitality, were dulled by stress. She could taste the burning ozone from the failing transport batteries outside, even filtered through the heavy-duty air exchangers. She activated the terminal with a single, deliberate press, her sharp claws hesitating above the input pad. This action was career suicide. It was political death. But the images flickering on the auxiliary monitor, the frozen bodies drifting past the viewport cameras, the sheer scope of the destruction the pulse had wrought, forced her hand. Survival was a primal scream, drowning out the whispers of pride. Initiating sector-wide emergency broadcast, encrypted Gilda Protocol 7, Draca announced, her voice a dry rasp. She began dictating, choosing her words not for grace, but for impact, knowing Ben was scrutinizing every syllable. This is Hierarch Draca of the Thrax Guilda, to all remaining transport and station personnel in Sector 17B. Effective immediately, the Guilda officially rescinds all punitive actions, tax levies, and jurisdictional claims against the human settlement designated Refuge Gamma 7 within the Kuiper Belt, effective immediately and permanently. All previous designations of non-compliant, hazardous, and unauthorized waste are hereby nullified. She paused, swallowing the bile rising in her throat. The hardest part remained. Ben tapped the side of the console with one finger. The apology, Hierarch. Be explicit. Draca closed her eyes for a fleeting second, feeling the heat of the bunker press against her chill, frightened skin. She took a deep, shuddering breath. Furthermore, she continued, projecting the words with forced authority, masking the searing humiliation. The Guilda was gravely mistaken regarding the stability and integrity of the facilities operated by Colonel Ben Stitch Atherton. The human engineering, previously dismissed, has proven to be the sole viable sanctuary in the face of the Centaurus solar pulse event. We formally apologize for the arrogance displayed and formally recognize Refuge Gamma 7 as an autonomous, sovereign, and essential partner in survival. The final word echoed sharply in the small command room. Draca slumped slightly, her energy drained. The broadcast confirmation signal pinged across the sector, locking in the concessions. Ben watched his terminal screen glow green. The data was irrefutable. The sector was his. Confirmed, Ben said, the single word delivering the final blow. He moved swiftly now, transitioning from political enforcer to field commander. All right, Hierarch. The price is paid. Now, the service. He accessed a separate reinforced console protected by a Faraday cage built into the wall. With the flick of 3 switches and the input of a rapid, complex code, the bunker began to change pitch. A low, powerful hum vibrated through the floor plates, the signature sound of heavy-duty thrusters spooling up. Deployment protocols! Drone Fleet Sigma 1! Ben muttered, his eyes fixed on the exterior tracking radar. Activate thermal shielding. Priority targets. Civilian transports 3, 5, and 9. Avoid debris fields. Conserve power. A heavy hydraulic thunk resonated directly above them as the main deployment bay doors, encased in layers of lead-lined ceramic armor, began to retract. The cold, sterile light of the deep space, intensified by the lingering solar radiation, flooded the observation port. Draca stared as 5 large, bulky recovery craft, constructed from salvaged engine hulls and equipped with powerful electromagnetic grapples, slid silently out of the refuge bay. They were ugly, patched, and painted with hastily applied yellow hazard stripes. They were everything the Guilda despised about human construction, and yet they were the only things moving in the entire shattered sector. Ben pointed to the main screen, where the transport lifelines were now dangerously low. 10 minutes left on those reserves, Hierarch. Your people are literally relying on my garbage to tow them home. The drones accelerated with deceptive speed, ignoring the space junk aesthetic, demonstrating the raw power of Ben's meticulously over-engineered propulsion systems. Draca felt a deep, sickening lurch in her stomach. It wasn't just the cold and the fear. It was the absolute, crushing realization that everything she had believed, every foundational principle of Thrax Guilda supremacy, had been utterly, demonstrably false. The humans weren't trash. They were the architects of survival. Tell me, Draca managed, her voice barely a whisper, watching the drones accelerate toward the freezing alien ships. When you built this, did you know? Did you know we would need it? Ben didn't look away from the tracking screen. His face, etched with fatigue and years of underestimation, was grim. "I knew the Sun would not care about your tax codes, Hierarch," he stated flatly. "I knew the physics of a 300-year cycle couldn't be argued away with rhetoric. You asked for conformity. I built for survival. There's a difference." The first recovery drone reached Transport 5. A colossal magnetic grapple shot out, clamping onto the hull of the dying ship, stabilizing it against the debris storm kicked up by the pulse. The small victory was displayed on the screen, a fragile, blinking icon of hope. The operation was underway, but the tension was far from over. Ben still had the lives of her clades in his hands, and Draka was now utterly, helplessly dependent on the Lixo Humano she had sworn to eradicate. The small victory was displayed on the screen, a fragile, blinking icon of hope. The operation was underway, but the tension was far from over. Ben still had the lives of her clades in his hands, and Draka was now utterly, helplessly dependent on the human garbage she had sworn to eradicate. The minutes stretched into an eternity, measured by the whining of the refuge's generators and the dwindling power icons on the Thrax ships. Transport 3, carrying critical medical personnel, was struggling. The residual solar wind, though weakened, still buffeted the magnetic grapples, causing the line tension to spike dangerously. "Their stabilizers are completely shot," Ben muttered, his eyes glued to the oscillating stress graph. "The drone's internal dampeners are compensating, but not for long. Hierarch, if that line snaps, we lose them to the void." Draka watched the chaotic display, a flurry of red warnings that meant nothing to her, yet everything to Ben. She understood complex economic theory, celestial navigation, and regulatory compliance. She did not understand the granular reality of survival engineering. "What must be done?" she demanded, the raw fear finally stripping away the last remnants of her imperious tone. "Manual override," Ben said, reaching out to a secondary physical console, a panel secured with heavy-duty fasteners. Not the sleek, holographic interfaces favored by the Gilda. "My system knows the optimal towpath, but the debris field around their old comms array is denser than anticipated. I need to run Transport 3 slightly off course, riskier, but faster." He ignored the automated protest warnings popping up in the corner of his screen. The Gilda systems prioritized protocol. Ben's system prioritized result. His fingers flew across the worn keys, his movements precise, ingrained by decades of fixing problems the easy way or the hard way. He was manually piloting a 4-kilometer tow line through a radioactive blizzard, pushing the salvage drones past their designed stress limits. The magnetic grapple on Transport 3 groaned, the sound transmitted faintly through the subetheric comms line, sharp enough to make Draka flinch. Then, the graph stabilized. Ben had done the impossible. He had threaded a crippled massive vessel through a churning vortex of metal shards and residual energy. "T3 stabilized. Trajectory confirmed," Ben announced, leaning back, the tension in his shoulders finally easing slightly. His face was pale, but resolute. "Bring them home." The remaining 5 minutes of fuel reserve on Transport 5 turned into a tense, agonizing wait as the drones, burning through their stored power, began the final deceleration. One by one, the alien ships, scarred and lifeless, were nudged toward the gigantic, crude airlock doors of the refuge, doors made of reinforced, multi-layered scrap metal that Draka had previously designated an eyesore on sector maps. As the first Thrax survivors, shivering and shocked, were cycled into the human habitat, Draka felt a tremor run through the refuge deck plates. The sound of the massive, over-engineered pumps regulating the air mixture was deafening compared to the whisper-quiet life support systems of her flagship. Ben escorted Draka out of the command center, the sterile, functional hallway lit by utilitarian LED strips that hummed slightly. They passed a group of recently rescued Thrax workers, huddled under thermal blankets that read, Refuge salvage crew. They looked utterly bewildered, their sophisticated scales dulled by the cold, inhaling the air supplied by the human they had mocked. "Your people are safe," Ben said, stopping before a heavy, blast-proof divider. "For now. We have supplies for a rotation, maybe two. The pulse has disrupted the entire sector. Resupply is impossible until the residual radiation drops." Draca stared at the metallic floor, avoiding the sight of the saved clades. She had been rescued, saved by the very structure she had ordered demolished. The realization of her colossal, fatal misjudgment weighed on her like crushing gravity. Finally, she raised her head, her golden eyes meeting Ben's tired gaze. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a terrible humility. "The fines," she whispered, her voice rough. The tariffs on the non-conforming materials, the demolition order, they were all still active hours ago. Ben looked at the door they were standing by. It was held closed by a complex system of redundant hydraulic locks, each part stamped with a serial number she would have rejected on aesthetic grounds. Those fines were based on a system of law designed for convenience and vanity. Hierarch, Ben stated, his tone devoid of triumph, heavy with fact. "That system is now frozen debris floating outside. The only law operating here is physics and survival." He paused, letting the functional silence of the protected environment speak for itself. "I didn't save your people for vengeance or profit, Draca. I saved them because that is what you do when the sun doesn't care about your titles." Ben continued, stepping closer, his presence suddenly immense despite his worn uniform. "But understand this. The Guild's authority in this sector is finished. The refuge is the new authority. Any future decisions regarding infrastructure, resource allocation, and safety protocols will be made here by the architects of survival, not the purveyors of aesthetics." Draca looked around the bunker, the reinforced cables, the exposed piping, the crude efficiency of every component. It was ugly. It was non-conforming. It was life. She gave a single slow nod, a concession more meaningful than any treaty signed in a gilded hall. "Understood, Colonel," she replied, the address now carrying a weight of respect she had never intended to offer a human. Ben simply nodded back, a silent acknowledgement of the fundamental shift in cosmic power. He turned, walking toward the generator core, the beating heart of his ugly, glorious creation. Outside the thick hull, the residual radiation from the solar blizzard shimmered, cold and deadly, ready to reduce the artifacts of alien vanity to dust. But inside, beneath the surface of a forgotten asteroid, humanity's resilience, built not on style but on necessary defiance, had established the bedrock for a new order. The garbage dump was now the capital of the Kuiper Belt, and the humans, once deemed fit only for removal, were now the indispensable gatekeepers of the dawn.